I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now, because this is not just another escalation in deteriorating bilateral relations, not just another round of threats and counter threats that will eventually be resolved through diplomatic negotiations, and certainly not just another example of trade tensions where both sides posture aggressively before finding compromise that allows them to claim victory. What we are witnessing is the Mexican government announcing 1 minute ago that it has completed preparation of what it characterizes as comprehensive economic response measures to be implemented immediately if Trump proceeds with threatened sanctions targeting Mexican financial institutions and Mexican access to American financial systems. And the Mexican statement makes explicitly clear that the response would include not just reciprocal financial restrictions on American institutions operating in Mexico, but also emergency nationalization of American company assets in critical sectors and suspension of security cooperation, including intelligence sharing and joint operations against drug trafficking organizations that American law enforcement has depended on for decades. I have spent decades watching power from the inside, first as a Republican operative who helped construct policy frameworks around economic sanctions, financial warfare, and the strategic use of economic leverage in international relations. Then, as a constitutional lawyer who has litigated cases about executive authority, property rights, and the constitutional boundaries of presidential power over foreign commerce and foreign assets. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, what Mexico announced 1 minute ago represents the most serious threat to American economic interests and to American security cooperation in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Revolution. And the threat is credible rather than rhetorical because Mexican government has clearly prepared detailed implementation plans and has secured support from domestic constituencies and from international partners that would make implementation politically sustainable despite whatever retaliation the United States might attempt. So I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, what happens when the United States threatens financial sanctions against Mexico, America's second largest trading partner, and a country where American companies have invested over $140 billion in operations ranging from manufacturing to financial services to energy production? And Mexico responds by threatening to nationalize those assets if sanctions are implemented. Second, what happens when that threat includes explicit warning that Mexico would suspend security cooperation that has resulted in interdiction of hundreds of tons of fentanyl precursors, that has enabled American law enforcement operations against cartel leadership, and that has provided intelligence that American agencies have used to dismantle trafficking networks affecting American communities? And third, what happens when Mexican officials, in background briefings to international media, make clear that they have coordinated with Chinese financial institutions to ensure that Mexican access to international financial systems would continue even if American sanctions attempted to isolate Mexico, effectively demonstrating that American financial dominance is no longer absolute, and that countries facing American financial pressure have alternatives that make American sanctions less devastating than they would have been in previous eras. These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time in emergency meetings at American companies with significant Mexican operations, where executives are calculating potential losses if nationalization occurs and are making urgent representations to the White House that sanctions must not be implemented if those sanctions trigger Mexican retaliation. In American law enforcement and intelligence agencies, where officials are assessing how loss of Mexican cooperation would affect their capabilities and their operations. And in financial markets, where traders are repricing both American and Mexican assets based on recognition that the bilateral relationship has deteriorated to a point where outcomes that were previously unthinkable are now realistic possibilities that must be factored into investment decisions. For more than a century, since American emergence as global financial power and since the dollar became the dominant currency for international transactions, the United States had maintained strategic advantage in international relations through its control over access to American financial systems and through its ability to use that control as leverage over countries whose integration into global economy required access to dollar-denominated transactions and to American financial institutions. The leverage had been exercised with varying degrees of aggressiveness depending on circumstances and on which countries were targeted, but the fundamental mechanism was well established. Countries that faced American financial sanctions found it extremely difficult to conduct international commerce, to access capital markets, to maintain currency stability, or to participate in the global economic system that had developed around American financial dominance. The sanctions had been deployed effectively against adversaries including Iran, North Korea, and Russia, where American ability to cut countries off from dollar transactions and from American financial institutions had imposed severe economic costs that achieved some American policy objectives even without military intervention. The success of financial sanctions against adversaries had created temptation within American policy circles to consider whether similar tools could be used against countries that weren't adversaries, but that were pursuing policies Washington opposed. The logic was seductive. If financial pressure could force adversaries to moderate behavior, couldn't similar pressure force allies or partners to comply with American preferences on issues where traditional diplomatic pressure was insufficient? The appeal of financial leverage was that it appeared to provide American policymakers with instrument that was more coercive than diplomacy, but less risky than military force, allowing United States to shape other countries' behavior without the costs and risks associated with kinetic operations. But that logic ignored fundamental differences between using financial pressure against isolated adversaries with limited international integration versus using financial pressure against major trading partners deeply integrated into American economic system and into broader global economy. When United States sanctioned Iran or North Korea, countries that were already partially isolated and that had limited trade with American companies, the costs of sanctions fell primarily on targeted countries, while costs to American interests were minimal because limited existing economic integration meant limited American exposure. When United States contemplated sanctions against Mexico, a country that conducted $800 billion in annual bilateral trade, where American companies had $140 billion in invested assets, and where supply chain integration meant that disrupting Mexican access to American financial systems would inevitably disrupt American companies and American workers dependent on that integration, the cost-benefit calculation was fundamentally different. Sanctions that disrupted Mexican economy would inevitably disrupt American economy due to integration. Financial pressure that isolated Mexico from American systems would damage American companies operating in Mexico. Any Mexican retaliation would affect American interests that had significant exposure to Mexican policy decisions. The asymmetry that made financial sanctions effective against adversaries didn't exist with integrated partners, and attempting to use financial pressure against such partners risked triggering retaliation that could damage American interests as much as or more than sanctions damaged targeted country. Every previous American administration had understood these dynamics and had carefully avoided threatening financial sanctions against major trading partners precisely because the risks exceeded any plausible benefits. Even during serious disputes with allies over specific policies, American officials had maintained distinction between diplomatic pressure, trade remedies, and targeted sanctions on one hand, and comprehensive financial sanctions that attempted to isolate countries from American financial systems on the other. The distinction wasn't arbitrary. It reflected understanding that comprehensive financial sanctions against integrated partners would trigger escalation spirals where both sides imposed increasingly severe economic damage on each other in ways that served no one's interests. But that understanding, that recognition that financial sanctions were appropriate tools against isolated adversaries, but not against integrated partners, has been abandoned by Trump administration that apparently views all economic relationships as potential sources of leverage. And that has threatened to impose sanctions on Mexican financial institutions if Mexico doesn't comply with American demands on immigration enforcement, on trade policy, on security cooperation, and on various other issues where Mexican policy has diverged from American preferences. The threat had been building for weeks through increasingly aggressive statements from Treasury Department officials and through reports that administration was developing sanctions packages targeting Mexican banks that administration claimed were facilitating money laundering for drug cartels or were enabling financial flows that supported irregular migration. The stated justifications were pretextual. Every serious analyst understood that Mexican financial institutions operated under regulatory frameworks comparable to international standards, and that any money laundering concerns could be addressed through normal law enforcement cooperation rather than through sanctions that would attempt to cut Mexican institutions off from American financial systems. The real purpose was coercive. Administration believed that threatening Mexican financial sector would create pressure that would force Mexican government to accommodate American demands across multiple policy areas where diplomatic pressure and trade threats had proven insufficient. The calculation was that Mexican economy was so dependent on access to American financial systems that threat of losing that access would override any political or strategic considerations that had made Mexican government resistant to American pressure on other issues. The calculation was catastrophically wrong in ways that are now becoming apparent. Mexican government under President Claudia Sheinbaum had concluded months ago that accommodation to American pressure was politically unsustainable and strategically unwise, and had been developing contingency plans for exactly the scenario of American financial sanctions. Those plans, now revealed through Mexican government announcement 1 minute ago, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both Mexican leverage and American vulnerabilities. The Mexican response strategy has 3 components, each designed to impose maximum costs on American interests, while demonstrating that Mexico has alternatives to American financial systems that make Mexican economy less vulnerable to American sanctions than administration had assumed. The first component addresses American company assets in Mexico. Mexican legal framework includes provisions for expropriation when national security or national interest requires it. And Mexican political dynamics would strongly support government seizing American assets in response to American sanctions that Mexican public opinion would view as economic warfare. The nationalization threat creates immediate problem for administration because American companies with Mexican exposure are now lobbying frantically against implementing sanctions that would trigger Mexican retaliation affecting their assets. The second component addresses security cooperation that American law enforcement and intelligence agencies depend on for operations affecting American interests. Mexican statement notes that current cooperation, including intelligence sharing, joint operations against trafficking organizations, and Mexican interdiction of fentanyl precursors, is provided voluntarily based on shared interests, and that American sanctions would fundamentally alter Mexican assessment of whether cooperation serves Mexican interests. The statement makes explicit that sanctions would trigger immediate suspension of cooperation, pending Mexican government review of whether relationship with United States warranted continued security partnership. The threat is devastating for American agencies that have built operations around Mexican cooperation and that have no ability to achieve similar results through American-only operations. DEA operations in Mexico depend on Mexican government approval and on information Mexican authorities provide. Intelligence regarding cartel operations comes largely from Mexican sources. Interdiction of precursor chemicals occurs in Mexican territory with Mexican personnel. Losing that cooperation would cripple American counter-narcotics efforts and would result in significant increases in fentanyl reaching American communities. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. But when key security partner threatens to end cooperation that American operations depend on, you're watching potential dismantling of institutional relationships that took decades to build and that serve American interests in ways that can't be easily replaced. The third component addresses financial alternatives that would allow Mexico to maintain international economic integration, even if American sanctions attempted to isolate Mexican financial institutions. Mexican's statement notes that Mexican government has negotiated arrangements with Chinese financial institutions, with European banks, and with multilateral development institutions that would allow Mexican companies and Mexican financial institutions to conduct international transactions in currencies other than dollars and through financial systems that American sanctions couldn't disrupt. The arrangements include currency swap lines with China, allowing peso-yuan transactions, agreements with European banks to clear Mexican international transactions through euro-denominated systems, and commitments from multilateral institutions to maintain lending and financial relationships with Mexico, regardless of American sanctions. The arrangements demonstrate that American financial dominance, while still significant, is no longer absolute in ways that allow United States to completely isolate countries from international financial systems when those countries have secured alternative arrangements with other major economies. Within minutes of Mexican announcement, the effects began cascading through corporate and government systems in ways that revealed how seriously the threats were being taken and how much damage Mexican retaliation could inflict on American interests. At American companies with significant Mexican operations, emergency board meetings were convened to assess exposure and to coordinate lobbying efforts demanding that administration not implement sanctions that would trigger nationalization. General Motors, with $8 billion in Mexican manufacturing assets, Ford with $6 billion, and other automotive companies made urgent representations to White House that sanctions must not proceed if they would result in loss of facilities that those companies' North American production strategies depended on. American financial institutions with Mexican operations, including Citigroup, JP Morgan, and Bank of America, expressed alarm that sanctions targeting Mexican banks would inevitably affect their own Mexican subsidiaries and would damage relationships with Mexican clients that represented significant revenue sources. American energy companies, including ExxonMobil and Chevron, with investments in Mexican energy sector, warned that nationalization would not only cost them specific assets, but would create precedent that would make any American investment in Mexico perpetually vulnerable to expropriation if bilateral relations deteriorated. The collective message from corporate America was unambiguous. Proceeding with sanctions would trigger Mexican retaliation that would cost American companies tens of billions and would damage American economic interests far more than sanctions would advance any American policy goal. At American law enforcement and intelligence agencies, the response was equally alarmed. DEA Administrator Ann Milgram issued internal memo, portions of which leaked to media within hours, warning that loss of Mexican cooperation would fundamentally compromise American counter-narcotics capabilities and would result in significant increases in drug availability in American communities. FBI officials responsible for transnational criminal organization investigations expressed similar concerns, noting that Mexican cooperation provided intelligence and operational support that American agencies couldn't replicate through unilateral operations. Department of Homeland Security officials warned that suspension of Mexican security cooperation would affect not just counter-narcotics, but also counter-terrorism operations, human trafficking investigations, and border security operations that depended on Mexican information and Mexican interdiction of criminals before they reached American territory. The consensus across American national security bureaucracy was that Mexican security cooperation was too valuable to risk through financial sanctions that would inevitably trigger Mexican retaliation, including suspension of that cooperation. In financial markets, reaction was immediate repricing of risk based on recognition that Mexican threats were credible and that implementation would damage American interests and Mexican interests in ways that would reduce value of assets in both countries. American companies with significant Mexican exposure saw stock prices decline as investors priced in nationalization risk. Mexican government bonds declined in value as investors demanded higher yields to compensate for increased political risk and for potential complications if American sanctions disrupted Mexican access to international financial systems. The peso weakened against the dollar as currency traders anticipated that financial conflict would damage Mexican economy and would reduce peso stability. But notably, the market movements weren't panic or collapse. They were measured repricing that reflected investor assessment that both countries would suffer damage from financial conflict, but that neither would face catastrophic outcomes because Mexican government had prepared alternatives that would limit damage to Mexican economy, while American company exposure to Mexico meant American economic interests would suffer significant harm that would create political pressure for conflict resolution. Markets were essentially betting that rational cost-benefit analysis would eventually prevent both sides from implementing threats that would damage both sides, but were also recognizing that rationality wasn't guaranteed and that risk premiums needed to reflect real possibility that conflict would escalate despite mutual damage. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is understanding how financial sanctions against integrated partner create escalation dynamics that are extremely difficult to control once initiated, and why the threats both sides are now making could trigger economic and security damage that neither side actually wants, but that neither could prevent once retaliation cycles begin. The fundamental problem is that comprehensive financial sanctions represent crossing a threshold that changes the nature of bilateral relationship in ways that are difficult to reverse. Financial sanctions against adversaries like Iran or North Korea are understood by all parties as instruments of coercive pressure between countries that have fundamentally conflictual relationships. Both sides understand sanctions are hostile acts, and both sides adjust their behavior accordingly. Financial sanctions against major trading partner and security cooperation partner like Mexico would signal that United States no longer views relationship as partnership requiring careful management, but rather views it as adversarial relationship where economic and security cooperation are contingent on Mexican compliance with American demands. Once that signal is sent through implementing sanctions, Mexican government would have strong incentive to respond in ways that demonstrate costs of treating Mexico as adversary rather than as partner, both to impose immediate costs on United States that might force reversal of sanctions and to establish deterrent against future American pressure by demonstrating that Mexico has capability to retaliate effectively. The retaliation would trigger American counter-retaliation, both because domestic political pressures would demand response to Mexican actions affecting American interests, and because allowing Mexican retaliation to succeed without response would suggest American threats were empty. The cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation would escalate because each side would face domestic political pressure to demonstrate strength, and neither side could back down without appearing weak. You can't use financial sanctions against integrated partners without triggering retaliation that damages your own interests, because integration means your interests are vulnerable to their policy decisions. You can't maintain security cooperation with partners you're attempting to economically isolate because cooperation requires trust and mutual benefit that sanctions explicitly reject. Once escalation begins through implementing threats that both sides have now made explicit, rational cost-benefit analysis suggests both sides would prefer to avoid mutual damage, but political dynamics and credibility concerns make de-escalation extremely difficult because both governments face domestic audiences that would interpret backing down as weakness. The situation has reached a point where both sides have made threats that would be costly to implement but would be politically embarrassing to withdraw, creating classic escalation trap where neither side wants conflict, but neither can easily avoid it. The real story isn't the specific threats or the specific policy disputes that triggered current crisis. The real story is how Trump administration approach to bilateral relationship has systematically destroyed the diplomatic mechanisms and the mutual trust that previously allowed even serious disputes to be managed without escalating to threats of financial sanctions and asset nationalization that would damage both countries. Every previous administration had maintained understanding that there were boundaries neither side would cross because crossing them would trigger escalation that served no one's interests. Those boundaries have been systematically violated by administration that apparently believes threatening everything, including financial isolation and security relationship, gives United States maximum leverage, discovering too late that threatening everything eliminates any escalation room and creates a situation where Mexican government concludes it has nothing left to lose by implementing retaliation that administration assumed Mexico would never actually execute. This affects American companies with Mexican operations who now face nationalization risk that didn't exist before administration threatened sanctions. It affects American security operations that depend on Mexican cooperation that will be suspended if sanctions proceed. It affects American consumers who will face higher drug availability and potentially higher prices for goods produced through US-Mexico supply chains if conflict disrupts economic integration. It affects American credibility with other partners who are watching and concluding that deep integration with the United States creates vulnerabilities when American policy becomes aggressive and unpredictable. The abstraction of financial warfare becomes concrete when American companies lose billions in nationalized assets, when fentanyl deaths increase because Mexican cooperation ended interdiction operations, when prices spike because supply chain integration that kept costs low has been destroyed by policy that treated economic relationships as weapons. The tragedy is that this crisis was entirely avoidable and serves no American interests that couldn't be better achieved through normal diplomatic engagement. Financial sanctions don't force democratic partners to comply. They force those partners to demonstrate their independence and their capability to retaliate. Mexican government has now demonstrated both and has made clear it's prepared to impose costs on American interests if administration proceeds with sanctions. The choice now is whether administration recognizes the trap it's created and backs away from threats that would trigger mutual damage, or whether it proceeds despite warnings and discovers that Mexican retaliation is real and that American interests pay price for policy that mistook threats for strategy. 1 minute ago, Mexico announced it's prepared to nationalize American assets and suspend security cooperation if financial sanctions proceed. American companies and American agencies are pleading with administration not to proceed. Financial markets are pricing in real risk of escalation, and the window for avoiding crisis that damages both countries is closing rapidly as political dynamics on both sides make backing down increasingly difficult. The damage that implementation would cause will be measured in billions of dollars lost and in lives lost to drugs that Mexican cooperation currently interdicts. And responsibility will rest with officials who believed threatening everything would force compliance, discovering too late that it forced confrontation neither country can afford.